A man named Dade had worked hard to compete for the position of HR manager. However, instead of landing the job, he was assigned an unexpected task: kidnapping. The company's scheme was simple: force kidnapped executives to reveal confidential company information. Once they spoke, it would be considered a breach of their non-disclosure agreements, allowing the company to fire them without severance pay. Among the candidates, the oldest was Dade. At 60 years old, he needed this job more than anyone. With no other options, he took a job at an assembly line factory. As his savings dwindled, factory supervisors exploited his desperation. One day, Dade finally snapped. However, every action has consequences. The factory supervisor demanded 100,000 euros in damages. Despite Dade's insistence that the supervisor had struck first, the legal system was stacked against him. In his frustration, Dade insulted the opposing lawyer, causing the lawsuit to escalate. If the court ruled against him, he would lose his home. His two daughters had families of their own, and his pride as the head of the household prevented him from asking for help. Standing on a bridge, contemplating the idea of ending it all, he decided to fight one last time. The next day, his wife brought good news. A publicly traded company in town was hiring an HR manager. She encouraged Dade to give it a shot. Though skeptical, he sent in his resume. To his surprise, his past military experience caught the attention of CEO Charles, who pushed his application through the initial screening. However, Dade completely botched the written test and interview. Yet, against all odds, he still made it through. That was when he finally learned the truth. The job required kidnapping. Although it was officially framed as role-playing to assess executives' stress tolerance and loyalty, Dade knew it was illegal. Still, he had come too far to back out now. If he wanted to outperform the other candidates, he needed to prepare. His first move was to seek out an old friend, Bai, a former programmer. Like Dade, Bai had struggled to find work due to his age and was now stuck in the same factory job. Since Bai had refused to testify against Dade, he had also been fired. Dade asked Bai to hack into the recruitment website and find out who his competitors were. But when he saw the results, his heart sank. His rivals were all highly educated. Some had PhDs, others multiple degrees.
How was he supposed to compete with that?
But Bai reassured him. This isn't a test of academic credentials, Bai said. It's about psychological warfare. Dade found merit in that advice and left Bai in charge of gathering intel on the executives. Meanwhile, he sought out a retired soldier with battlefield experience, hoping to learn interrogation and kidnapping techniques. The price for such lessons wasn't cheap. Dade haggled the cost down by more than half, eventually settling on 25,000 euros. Even at that reduced price, he still didn't have the money. Desperate, he turned to his son-in-law for a loan. However, his son-in-law hesitated and refused, citing the expenses of his wife's pregnancy. Dade saw through the excuse. The truth was, his son-in-law looked down on him for being unemployed. Infuriated, Dade headbutted him. At this point, he was like a gambler betting everything on one final chance. With no alternative, he approached his pregnant daughter and lied, claiming her husband had agreed to lend him the money. She handed over 35,000 euros. When she later found out the truth, she was devastated and turned to her mother for help. Even his wife, the person who trusted him most, questioned his sanity. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said. "Because right now, you're gambling with our entire future. You're putting our daughter's family at risk." But Dade wasn't fazed. He firmly believed that if he got the job, he could fix everything with money. Finally, the kidnapping training began. On the first day, his instructor punched him hard in the gut. "Let's see what you're made of," the man sneered. To succeed in this final test, Dade had to approach it like a game. The first rule: keep the kidnapped executives calm. If they sensed an opportunity, they would surely try to signal for help. But the company had already activated signal jammers, making it impossible to make outside contact. One of the executives, a finance director, was caught hiding a mobile phone. He was immediately taken to another room for individual interrogation. The others, witnessing this, were shaken. For the job candidates, this was their chance to prove themselves. The competition was ruthless. Most of them resorted to verbal intimidation. Dade knew this was his moment to stand out. Using a walkie-talkie, he issued an order: strip him down. Then, he had the finance director's work computer brought in. Interrogation had to be done step by step. Start with minor secrets first, like asking for the computer password. However, the finance director turned out to be tougher than expected. Taking advantage of a brief moment of distraction, he grabbed a gun from one of the captors. Luckily, the bullet hadn't been chambered. Watching the scene unfold from the surveillance room, the interview candidates broke into a cold sweat. The next phase involved taking the head of public relations aside and letting the candidates interrogate him directly. But upon hearing this, Dade quietly picked up his bag. He had made a decision. If they wanted to roleplay a kidnapping, he was going to make it real. The others were stunned. No one could understand what Dade was doing. And since they couldn't be sure whether his gun was loaded, no one dared to challenge him. In the midst of confused stares from the executives, Charles, the CEO who had just been shot, suddenly stood back up as if nothing had happened. Even the professional kidnappers were dumbfounded. Wasn't this just an act? Why wasn't this guy following the script? Seeing Charles fail to cooperate, Dade immediately slapped him. This was a technique he had specifically learned. Kidnappers couldn't afford to treat hostages like human beings. Dade already knew from former employees that the HR manager position had been pre-selected. He had never had a real shot at getting the job. In his desperate bid for employment, he had destroyed his family and lost everything. Since the company wanted to play games, he was going to make sure they lost this one. Just as Dade prepared to destroy the security cameras, gunshots rang out. Dade wasn't bluffing. A desperate man could do anything. He ordered the wounded executive to be taken away and then began venting his frustration. He threatened to expose the company's crimes and bring them down with him. But with only 2 eyes, he couldn't watch everyone at once. A single gunshot echoed through the building. Furious, Dade stormed back into the main hall and forced the hostages to press their faces against the windows. The police had surrounded the building. When they asked about his demands, Dade's response was heartbreaking. All he wanted was a job to support his family. But the police couldn't agree to that. Their snipers were already in position, waiting for the right moment to take him down. Dade knew this, which was why he kept the hostages at the windows to block their line of sight. Then his wife called. That was when he knew his time was almost up. He picked up the phone and ordered the hostages to crouch down. Then, pretending to have a breakdown, he walked toward the company's archives. Seeing him leave, the hostages immediately rushed toward the elevators. The police stormed the building moments later. Dade, however, calmly sat in an office, waiting for them. When they arrived, he collapsed onto the desk and surrendered. Everyone assumed he was just a desperate, unemployed man who had lost his mind. But no one noticed that when the finance director had unlocked his computer earlier, Dade had inserted a USB drive. This had been his real plan all along. The USB contained the leverage he needed to negotiate with the company. So, what do you do when you realize a job interview was just a scam? This man pulled a gun and kidnapped the entire executive team, including the CEO. His demand was simple. He just wanted a job. But this wasn't just an impulsive act. The kidnapping was merely a means to an end. His real goal was hacking into the company's secret vault. Thanks to CEO Charles's twisted scheme of using kidnappings to trick executives into breaking confidentiality agreements, Dade saw an opportunity. He forced the finance director to connect his computer to the company's internal network. Charles was enjoying watching his executive squirm until he became a hostage himself. Dade wasn't afraid of getting caught. In fact, he deliberately let the vice president escape so he could alert the authorities. He knew that once the police sent a negotiator, or better yet, his wife to plead with him, he would have the perfect excuse to release the hostages. With the building emptied, he returned to the finance director's computer. Plugging in the USB, he began transferring 22 million euros from the company's hidden funds into a secret account. His old friend Bai would take care of the money, but the police arrived faster than expected. With only 10% of the transfer remaining, Dade had to improvise. As officers stormed the room, he dramatically collapsed next to the computer. By the time they reached him, the transfer was complete. Dade quickly yanked out the USB and tossed it into the trash. With this ace up his sleeve, he was confident the company wouldn't dare press charges. If anything, they would help him cover it up. He felt a pang of guilt toward his family, but once this was over, they would never have to worry about money again. In the police report, Dade was labeled as a desperate, unemployed man who resorted to crime. His age, 60 years old, his 30-year mortgage, and his financial struggles instantly won public sympathy. Countless lawyers offered to defend him for free, but he couldn't tell anyone about the stolen money. Instead, he insisted on having his daughter, who was still just a law intern, represent him in court. As he awaited trial, Charles discovered that his money was missing. He immediately sent Tanner to negotiate with Dade. But instead of a peaceful deal, it was a threat. "We won't kill you, Mr. Dade," Tanner said. "We'll make sure you're comfortable until you decide to cooperate." Dade smirked. Did they really think a few threats would make him give the money back? But he underestimated how ruthless corporations could be. During his time in jail, he faced constant harassment. His meals were taken away. In the showers, he had to watch his back. In the yard, he was regularly attacked. As long as he didn't die, the guards didn't care. Dade needed a way out. Then he noticed a prison officer reading a management textbook. Clearly, the officer was preparing for an exam. Having spent decades in HR, Dade knew management inside and out. Just as he planned to befriend the officer, the company struck first. Several inmates dragged him into a cell and broke his fingers. The excruciating pain didn't break him. Instead, it landed him in the prison hospital, giving him a chance to see his family. But during the visit, he noticed something strange. His wife was wearing new clothes. Given their financial situation, she shouldn't have been able to afford them. Had she found someone else? He needed to get out fast. Back in prison, he approached the officer. By tutoring him for the exam, Dade secured a private cell. Then he contacted Bai. He needed Bai to investigate his wife. If he was wrong, he wanted Bai to use some of the stolen money to pay off the house. At first, Bai didn't believe Dade's wife would betray him, but after what he saw, he couldn't deny it. There was no mistaking it. She had moved on. Still, Bai hadn't realized that the company was also watching Dade's wife. That night, a masked intruder followed her home. She was given a death threat. Meanwhile, Dade remained unaware. His story made headlines, an unemployed worker taking his corporate bosses hostage. In prison, he became a hero. Inmates cheered him. Even the guards started respecting him. A publisher approached him with a book deal. The title? Dade, a voice for the unemployed. As his trial neared, his wife visited again. Dade showed her his newly healed hand. He had forgiven her. He blamed poverty for everything. Now, with fame and money, he believed he had won. But the judge wasn't buying it. "I see this as an attempt to intimidate the jury," the judge said. "Let me make one thing clear. In my courtroom, you will impress no one, Mr. Dade. You hear me? No one."